window, just make sure you're selecting all panelists and attendees so that we can see all of your comments. You can also engage on social media at What's Next CLT. Just tag us there. We're going to save a few minutes at the end to go through some questions. Alicia and Valaida are going to answer whatever you want to put out there. Go ahead and drop in the chat window. What's your biggest challenge as you share your organization story, especially as it relates to equitable storying and new ways of storytelling? Just go ahead and drop those in the chat window, and we're going to get to those at the end if we don't get to them before then. So as always, I want to begin by letting our panelists share a little bit about themselves and their work. Alicia works with the Free Press as a community organizer, and her work with journalists focuses on telling better, more equitable stories. Alicia, can you share a little bit about that work and what you're doing right now?
Absolutely. First of all, thanks so much, Janet, for having me here. I'm excited to be here today in this conversation with Valaida. At Free Press, I work on a project called News Voices, and our work is around mitigating power dynamics that exist between journalists and newsrooms and communities that they're a part of. So it means working with journalists to ensure that the journalism and news that's produced is necessary and important and relevant to community needs, and then working with community members to make sure that the stories that we need told and the information we need is what's coming out of newsrooms and the journalists around us. So doing that work and also intersects with racial justice, of course, thinking about whose stories haven't been lifted up and haven't been heard. So that's what we've been doing here in North Carolina, and then working to support projects across the country as well.
Awesome. Alicia, thank you for being here today. Valaida Fullwood is a Charlotte-based author, strategist, very smart person. You do so much work on philanthropy. And can you just share a little bit about what you're working on right now and your expertise?
Sure. Thank you, Janet. Again, I'm excited to have today's conversation and to join Alicia and to learn as much as we share what we know in the process. I guess my journey as a storyteller, or at least my embracing that, came through my involvement with the Giving Circle, New Generation of African-American Philanthropists. About a year into forming the circle, I had the idea to write a book about stories of giving in Black communities, which I thought was a story that hadn't been told or hadn't been told sufficiently, and wanted to amplify those stories, and spent 4.5 years interviewing over 200 Black donors across the country about what motivates them to give, and hearing their stories and sharing their stories. And then since then, for the last 10 years, have been rolling out more stories and hearing more people's stories, and which has brought me to this topic and to this panel today.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us also. I'm excited for everyone to hear the things that you both have to say. So we're going to set the stage for today's discussion. We're going to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time. There's some ideas that may be new to some of you, maybe not to others. If you're like me, you're going to see some things that maybe you wish you had done differently in the past, or that you want to start doing differently in the future. We're going to name some things that may make you uncomfortable or maybe not. But the name of today's game is progress. So no one gets it right all the time. The people on this call don't get it right all the time. So the purpose of today's conversation isn't to call out or criticize. It's just to be honest about the ways we tell stories and do a better job as a community of telling more complete stories. So grace and compassion for ourselves, for each other, and an open mind while we sit with some new ideas. So let's start with the big picture. Alicia, can we talk about what does a colonized narrative mean? We called today's session Decolonizing the Narrative. So how did we get here, and why is it important to break that down?
Yeah, I think in calling this kind of decolonizing our stories, we have to really root and think about what colonization is in the first place. And so which I get really excited to talk about, because there are two colonizations that are really rooted in the history of the United States. And that's settler colonialism and extractive colonialism, which are slightly different. Settler colonialism is the engineering the disappearance of a group of people. And so historically you see that with indigenous folks who have tribal affiliations or have historically had tribal affiliations here on this land. And then there's extractive colonialism, which is the process of taking as much of one resource from one place as you can. And you see that with the history of slavery and chattel slavery in the United States. And so storytelling is something that the United States has used from the very beginning, because it's a practice that everyone has used for the history of the world. We tell stories, we pass down information, we share important things with each other. But in a country that is kind of trying to build up the extractive colonialism and the settler colonialism, then the stories have to be woven in and connected to that. And so you see that with the kind of collaborations with news organizations or different institutions, government institutions, the narratives that they've created. And so today, to get to a place of decolonizing storytelling means thinking about both that history and acknowledging it, also kind of holding the way that white supremacy has played a role in creating and perpetuating colonization, the habits, the culture of white supremacy, which I think everyone probably in Charlotte, most people are familiar with, because I think almost everyone in Charlotte's been to a dismantling racism training at some point, at least over the past 4 years now. So thinking about that culture of white supremacy and how it plays into our stories. And what we know is that story becomes culture, and it influences how people perceive things. And that culture influences what actions people take and the policies that get passed. So it's really important that we are having this conversation today about decolonizing that.
Yes. And Valaida sent this quote. I think it's exactly what you were just saying, Alicia. Like the storyteller holds the power because they set the vision and the values and the agenda, and that becomes the policy, and the stories become truth. So I think it's more powerful than any other tool we have in a nonprofit tool belt, for sure. So today we're going to talk specifically about 4 ways that we often get this wrong or that we could do better. And then we're going to talk about some specific ways that we can do a little bit better, or things we can try to tell more complete stories. So we're going to dive right in because we have a lot of ground to cover. So Valaida, the first way we often do this is we take away agency. So can you tell us how you see this play out?
Yeah, I think about the African proverb that says, until the lion tells the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And so power dynamics are at play in interpersonal relationships, and they show up in stories. And though you may not have thought about that when you engage or share stories or convey people's stories, but it is important to be more conscious of some of those power dynamics, and how we convey a story can take away power or empower people and groups. And there are always inherent power dynamics at play, and as communicators or storytellers, we have to be proactive in one, in our consciousness, but also in taking measures to seed power and to share power and to offer more balanced range of stories. Mm-hmm. And so one of the phrases I often hear is, I want to be a voice for the voiceless. And while, yes, it's important to advocate for people, we also need to empower people to share their own stories. And while there may be a moment when you can speak or amplify a story, you also need to work to empower that person to share their own story, and not to leave them voiceless indefinitely.
Right. Yeah, I see that one all the time too, and it's time we move on to a new phrase, or again, not to call anybody out, but I mean, now we know that there are better ways to do this. So, Alicia, can you share what some of those ways are? How can we do better in this area?
Yeah, I think it starts with letting folks tell their stories. That and shifting that power dynamic, shifting that role. And perhaps that means that as the storyteller, you shift from being kind of the writer or the creator to being the coordinator and the curator and the organizer. Maybe instead of being the only one who tells stories for an organization, you're coordinating a multiplicity of stories, right? I think one of the things that dominant culture does really well is it creates one narrative, and there has to be one story, one thing that's easy to kind of tuck into your pocket and pull out whenever you need it. But we know that our communities are so nuanced and so multifaceted, right? And so even when we think about, I think just the communities I'm a part of, right? As a person who's in Black communities and queer communities, and I am not just any one of those identities, right? I am also parenting children. I am also organizing. And so that shows up when we allow people to tell their own stories. And I think a part of that has to be not just bringing people in and engaging them, but also equipping them with the tools that they need. There's this really incredible organization up in Chicago called City Bureau. And so they are the ones who, they really have they just coined the term of equipping and not engaging. And so I want to kind of give shout outs to them, because I did not make that box as myself. But I think when we equip people with the tools they need, whether it's a camera, whether it's a hotspot, whether it's a skill set, then we're able to also make sure we're building self-determination and autonomy when people are telling their stories. And I think to Valaida's point earlier, the person who's telling the story matters, right? One of the things in preparation for this conversation that I was talking to folks about was the fact that in Charlotte, across the board, a lot of our nonprofit leaders are white women, right? And a lot of the people in our community are not white women. And so when we have executive directors who are tasked really with carrying the story of an organization and deciding on what stories get told to funders and to partners and to advocates and government officials, then the story is going through one lens. And so I think it's important that we are hiring different people, and we're hiring Black photographers, writers, journalists. We're hiring storytellers of color, storytellers who have identities that exist on different margins of communities in Charlotte, and then that our organizations have cultures that enable them to be successful, and it's not just a churn. That there can be retention as well.
Mm-hmm. I love all of that. I actually love the idea of shifting it all the way. We're not storytellers, we're curators of stories. I mean, that gives the nuance that allows us just to collect and help amplify the stories versus feeling the need to filter them. That's really interesting. Okay, so one of my big ahas in some of the research and prep work was the idea that we start with secondly. Not something I'd spent a ton of time thinking about, but this idea came from a TED Talk by author Chimamanda Adichie. I hope I got her name right. But Alicia, this so closely relates to the colonization of a story you were talking about earlier. What does it mean to start with secondly?
Yeah, there's that quote, and I'm not sure exactly who said it first, but they say, when I feed the hungry, I'm called a saint. But when I ask why the hungry are poor, then I'm called a communist. And I think that's really interesting in this context, because when it comes to kind of, well, just use food as an example, right? Food security is a big issue in Charlotte and in a lot of communities. And it's much easier to say, okay, people can't eat. People don't have enough food. But that didn't come out of nowhere. There are systems that have been created. There's a context there. There's a history there as to why don't people have the land that they need to grow the food that they need? Why don't people have grocery stores in their communities? We are oftentimes looking at the outcomes and the symptoms instead of looking at the root cause and the core. And so our stories reflect that, right? And our storytelling, then we're saying this amount of people don't have grocery stores, or this amount of people don't have access to food, instead of saying, and also, this is what has caused this, and this is what we need to shift and what we need to change. And so a friend of mine who's a journalist and does a lot of work around reproductive justice and women's issues and a lot of work with immigrant communities, one of the questions that she uses all the time in her work is, what is the machine that made this problem? And so I think that's really key to think and to remember that every single problem that we can name, whether it's here or anywhere else, there is a machine that has created it and made it possible.
Yes. So you work with journalists every day. Like this is the main part of your work. So what do you tell them? Like what kind of advice do you give them about ways to give more context and history and to be more reflective about that?
Yeah, I'm always encouraging folks to contextualize anything. And you can't do everything with one story either, right? Whether it's in a newsroom or a nonprofit or a community grassroots community collective of people, no one story is going to be the be all end all. And so I think we have to divorce ourselves from the idea that one story can be the be all end all, because there might be one story that says, this is what we see now. But then there's another one that has to be, this is how this has happened. And even another one that says, and this is what we envision for the future, and what else is possible, what we've seen other places maybe, or what we have kind of heard from people in our community as to what's possible. So a lot of history and context, and then always asking why. Why is this the case? And I think you see that. One of the projects I'm working on right now is with the folks up in Philadelphia around criminal justice and around crime reporting. And so the communities, non-journalist communities up in Philadelphia are working with newsrooms to try to get them to shift the way that they report on crime. Because what normally happens across the board is that stories get told as to what is the violence that happened, or what is this moment of harm that happened. And there's not usually any context as to, and what were the power dynamics of this happening? What were the other kind of factors that were happening in this community or in this place? And so I think that's one good example of asking why. And in Charlotte, we see this when it comes to housing. There's a lot of stories that get told about the current state of housing and the current state of the housing crisis, but not as much diving and delving into how we got here and what are the kind of core systemic shifts that need to happen in order for us to shift the reality that we see now.
Yes, and I do want to give a shout out. I know Alicia used this as an example in our some of our prep work, but you're part of the Charlotte Journalism Collaborative, and you have done a big project on telling multiple sides of the housing story here. So we'll link to this in some of our follow-up, but I think this is a good example of how organizations can work together and partner to show multiple sides of a story.
Yeah, and a reminder that you don't have to tell a story alone. In fact, there's more power when you are collaborating and partnering with other people, because it not only does that story get more reach and get into the hands of different kinds of people, but there's different perspective that's there as well.
Right. Awesome. All right, so number 3, Valaida. We've talked a lot about this because a lot of your work is focused on this. We focus on the deficit. Tell us what that means.
Yeah, it's been kind of stuck or fixated on the problem or the gap and deficits. And we do that a lot in Charlotte. And, you know, we use studies and reports. And while we need those for context and to raise our awareness of issues, we shouldn't get stuck there, and more so focus on the possibilities versus the problem. So as we tell our stories, to really flip the script in many ways and convey what could be different or what things could look like in our wildest dreams. And so it does require some imagination. It does require us to reorient ourselves and how we look at people and communities and concerns in the community. But it's really important that we do that with our story, painting a picture or a scenario of what we'd like to see and what's possible and the opportunity we're missing by not embracing and supporting and strengthening areas where there are deficits or where there are issues.
Yeah, and I know one problem I see here with a whole range of nonprofits is that from a marketing perspective, people are going to act or buy or donate or volunteer based on the emotional trigger. So you can give people data all day long, but it's that emotional reaction that's going to cause their reaction and cause them to do something. So if the stories we're putting out are deficits, the emotions those are going to create are going to be pity or shame or guilt, and people are going to react out of those negative emotions. And in our last session, we talked about how important relationship is and how that's how you build long-term engagement and change things. So if we're acting out of all those negative emotions, I don't think that's the stuff that long-term relationship is built on. It's more built on possibility and doing things together and different stories. So this one reason I feel so passionate about this is I think if we tell a different story and evoke a different emotion, we can build a better relationship.
Right, and breathe energy into it rather than just depleting us of energy and hope. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important. And as you know, I'm working on the BOLD project with my giving circle, New Generation of African American Philanthropists, and that's one of the key areas that we're focusing on is around narratives and shifting to more of the asset frame of mind and lens versus being stuck in the deficit space, and where people are in need or what's needed versus where there are strengths to build on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you were talking about rooting yourself in vision. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I thought that was powerful.
Yeah, I think it requires some imagination and to see the joy in it, imagine something different, and to try to convey that.
Yeah.
And there is, I know Alicia has talked about, there is a tension, and sometimes it may feel like a contradiction to talk about really hard topics or issues or tell those stories with some element of joy and hope and possibility. And so there is a tension there. You do have to tell the truth and acknowledge the truth of the situation, and then shift to breathe life into what's possible and on what we can make possible and what we can see happening entirely differently.
Yeah, because both can be true at the same time. And that's a harder story to tell because it's harder to let those things live in tension with each other. But that does bring us straight to the next point about sharing a single narrative. So I think this is especially important in light of that third point. We often show only a single side of a person or issue, and when the story is mainly about deficit, that becomes the truth that people know about that community or person or issue. So Alicia, can you talk to us about the dangers here and what the alternative is?
Absolutely. And when stories are, the single narrative becomes the deficit story, then that is what people expect of folks in any given community, right? And I think about just at Enderley Park, for example, right, in West Charlotte. There is a story of Enderley Park that is a story of people being pushed out and people experiencing gentrification and people being exploited. And all of that is very true. And the thing that has been necessary is that in order to survive gentrification, in order to survive exploitation, in order to survive all of these things, people have had to be really creative. And people have had to create relationship with each other and networks and structures and businesses. And so when we're only looking at what is the extraction that's happened here, what is the harm that's happened here, then we miss that. And there is often, not only are they both true at the same time, but there's often a connection, right? When people have experienced harm and exploitation and extraction for so long and for so many generations, the only thing to do is to be creative in what you do. The only thing to do is to be innovative and to create new things and new practices and new ways of being. The only thing to do is to rely on each other and to build those networks and to build structures that reflect that. And so oftentimes it's the context and the history that informs the imagination of what's possible into the future. And so I think when our stories are able to weave between those spaces, then that's when they're the strongest, because we're also lifting up what folks have gained and learned from the experiences of oppression and marginalization. And that means that we have to, and that means that we have to bring in a lot of people telling those stories. I think the other piece of it is that the single narrative happens when we only tell stories in one modality or one methodology, right? And some of the kind of habits of white supremacy, there is this one that talks about the focus on written word. And everything has to be written. But globally, historically, storytelling has been passed down through conversation. It's been passed down through sitting with elders and learning from them, sitting at the feet of elders. And so I think the way that we see that today is one, there is still that opportunity. I mean, I think the pandemic has made it a little more crunchy. We got to figure that out. But the things that we do have access to is we have access to photo, we have access to audio, we have access to video. And we can rely on those kinds of things in addition to written storytelling to make sure that there is a wide variety of ways that stories are being told.
Yeah, and I think one of my takeaways here is that it just takes practice, and we're probably going to get it wrong before we get it right. And it's not going to be it's not like there's a 5-step thing of things you can do. It's going to take some practice of sharing these different stories and trying different ways and working with different people. So I think that's something to keep in mind too.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge opportunity we have right now in this moment, is to make major shifts in how we think and how we work with each other and how we engage and think about the world.
Yeah, so Valaida, can you share a little bit more about that, ways we can tell multidimensional stories? And I know you had talked about in our prep work a place you had seen this done really well.
Yes, well, 2 things come to mind. One, of course, writing the book Giving Back, and having, a multiplicity of stories that altogether convey a broader story of Black giving and showed all the various dimensions. So being open and doing the hard work of gathering multiple stories and curating multiple stories. But then the other thing, specifically in our state magazine a year ago exactly, I was featured on a story about Fonta Flora, not only the brewery, but also the lost community that's under Lake James in Burke County. And there were kind of 2 stories. So there's one story, 2 sisters who live in that area had done a lot of research through the census and through old documents and historical papers that tell an account of what happened back at the turn of the century when the community of Fonta Flora was flooded for the creation of Lake James by Duke Power at the time. And the writer also reached out to me because that is my family's legacy. My great-great-grandparents grew up there and had a farm there and were impacted. And I had the stories through oral history and through my elders and ancestors passing on those stories, and sometimes a few written papers about their life and experience at Fonta Flora. So I just thought it was a really great job of the reporter at our state magazine to weave the 2 accounts, not to only lean on the written account or the document and historical account by the 2 sisters, the 2 white sisters, but also to hear and acknowledge and respect the oral history that was passed on through my family.
This was a really interesting article, and I'm going to link to this too in some of our follow-ups so that everyone has access to that to read it. We are coming up on time. We don't have time for a lot of questions, but I'm seeing a few questions that center around walking that line and the tension of being able to tell a story quick enough to demonstrate impact, but also respecting like dignity in telling a whole story. So do you have any advice for that? Either one of you.
I do think it's the piece that comes with practice, right? The more you practice telling a story, the more you're going to pull out pieces of it that are more succinct and that are more clear. And I think taking the time to experiment with that and get feedback and create multiple feedback loops and being willing to shift. And this comes back to what you were saying, Janet, earlier about relationship. Like, are you in relationship with people either within your organization or outside of your organization that are going to tell you the truth and are going to hold you in accountability? because those are the people that you can practice with to figure out, am I striking this balance? Am I holding this line? But if you don't have those relationships where people are kind of pushing you to be better and to be a better you and pushing you on this line of equity, then the practice is not going to be as rich and as holistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just add ditto to everything Alicia said. I know it's not easy. It does take work. It does take practice. It does take intentionality, and there are huge benefits and payoffs when you do that. And to be open to feedback and to be reflective, and to have a diverse range of people who can give you candid, honest feedback.
Yeah, I mean, all of that's so powerful. And I think that is, I mean, as both of you said, my biggest takeaway today, I think, is just, I mean, we've just got to practice and we've just got to try things. Do you have any advice about just trying it? So if someone's looking at this and going, okay, I want to venture out, but I don't know where to start, like, what would be your best advice for just starting to venture out in these ways?
I think my first advice would be to just map out who are the people who are connected to the issues that you're telling stories about, and figuring out in that map who are the people you have relationships with and you're close to and who don't you know. Because if you start with the people that you have relationships with, or the people that the stories you've told or the conversations you've had, then you can ask those people, who else do I need to be talking to? Who else needs to be a part of this story? And you just continue to spiral and spiral. So all you can ever do is start where you are.
That's great advice. Valaida, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's kind of, I know a lot of funders are doing equity audits. I mean, in some ways, we also have to do our own kind of sourcing audits and relationship audits and determining who am I connected with? Who do I know? And if you found it's very homogeneous and you need to broaden out and build broader relationships and connect to more people, then I think it's important to get to that work. But you really need to be reflective and assess where you are as a person and in the relationships and connections you have around you. And that can alert you to potential blind spots that you've had in your storytelling and in your relationship building.
Yeah, and I'd just add real quick to build that practice of trusting people when they tell you their experiences. Even if it seems so counterintuitive to what you've experienced, or when it seems to push back against what you understand as kind of logic and causation, that it's so key and important to trust people when they tell you their truths.
That's good. That's really good. Reflection and relationships and practice. I mean, there's so much good stuff here, and I could keep talking about this all day. I wish we had time to keep doing that. But we're at the end of our time. So thank you, Valaida, and thank you for Alicia for joining us today. You dropped a lot of wisdom here today. So we will put up this recording so people can see it, but we just appreciate you sharing your time this week. We're also going to link to the work that each of you are doing in the community. We'll send that out and some of our follow-up so that you can follow their projects and their work and engage in that if anyone wants to. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Our next session is scheduled for Friday, October 9th at noon, and we'll have more details coming soon. We're getting ready to kick off a brand new series on what's next that will take us through next year. So we aren't quite ready to announce what it is yet, but stay tuned, that's coming soon. Thanks everybody, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.